Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander.
Linc, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Dan, thanks for having me.
Yeah. I was just saying your background is much more interesting than mine. Is that a virtual background or is that actually like an analog poster you have there?
It's a photography backdrop on my wall.
Cool. Cool.
Yeah, so I find the actual backdrop is better because let's say I'm going to show you a picture, I can use my phone.
Yeah.
As, it blurs it out. Plus, I'm in my 50s, so my silver hair, it'll make me look totally bald. And when that day comes, it comes. But until then, I'll show the hair I have. But those virtual ones, they just take it off.
Yeah, exactly. And you kind of just seem like a floating head, like you might be a deep fake or something. So I like the real background as well. But anyway, for those that don't know you, would you mind getting into your background a little bit and kind of how you're approaching what I think is like obviously a very timely issue, which is the labor shortage. And there's probably a million other ways to describe it, but everything that goes along with that and everything connected with that. So anyway, I'd love to only give you the floor.
Yeah, well, I started still the reason today that most males get into software development or computer science is they want to be video game developers. And back in the 80s, when I got into computer science, it was the same reason back in the good old Atari 2600 and then, Commodores and all that stuff. But you know what, like most people who get into software development and computer science, I never got to make video games because that doesn't end up being reality. But I've had a really great, very fortunate to have a 35-year career in technology. Have loved it, from working for a Seattle-based commercial software company to consulting to Fortune 500 to Department of Defense. You can do quite a bit in 35 years. And over that time span, I've also had a very nonprofit dual career, if you will, of how do you serve and how do you help? There's plenty of areas that need help. You can look in any direction. And kind of both of those with Night Moves have merged and have taken all of my experience and network from those 35 years and the problems I've seen in society that aren't getting solved fast enough and said, hey, how do we use all these innovation and lean startup and all these techniques to go in and really disrupt the problems that are disrupting us?
Yeah. And before we get into that, just as a little sidebar on the video game topic, it's super interesting because I was like listening to an interview with Mark Andreessen, I think the other week, and he was talking about that, how the talent that comes out of the video game world is really like underappreciated and isn't given the light it should, like within Silicon Valley. And I have really fond memories of getting into video games like from my childhood. And I'm definitely less in the technology space formally, but definitely think that was a formative experience. So I think that's kind of an interesting parallel. But kind of getting into what you're doing now with Night Moves, to give everyone a little context, can you talk about that work and just kind of like what you're typically doing on a day-to-day level there?
Yeah, and we do four things. So if you think of the four legs on our stool, the first is we have a training program where our graduates, when they complete, they are actually better prepared for on-the-job work than a four-year computer science degree graduate. We're not a code camp. We're a very unique way of how we do our training. And we're able to get young people into it because if we don't get people into technology by the time they're 18, then like in Iowa, the average age of someone who gets into technology, like goes to a code camp, if they waited till after they're 18, is 36 years old. So our mission is we work with the youth, typically, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th graders, to get them into tech because they have no idea what a career in tech is. They have no interest. We're able to go, wow, I had no idea we were interested in a career in technology. What's my next step? So that's the first thing we do is get interest in it. And then our training pathway, which is still about a 3-year pathway. So it's not like, this isn't a drive-through fast food kind of approach at training. It's very comprehensive, but we want to start at least at the latest in their junior year in high school. And by the time they launched and start their career, they have no debt from their education. Imagine that, starting your career without the debt and being better prepared than a 4-year graduate. The second thing we do is we are very focused on Native American, urban underserved, and rural communities. So wherever we're at, let's say our overall focus is how do we take and put a machine in place where every year we're creating 15 to 25 high-paying jobs a year. So even in urban underserved, right, it's the reverse gentrification process, where how do you take people from those communities, in those communities, prosper them, revitalize those communities with the people from them without pushing them out, right? And then Native Americans and rural, that's kind of a little more obvious, right? Because we will bring the employers to our graduates, right? We don't just train them. We get agreements with employers that if our graduates are rural or Native American, that they don't request or require them to relocate, which that's one thing. Thank you, COVID. You made that a lot easier than it was 5 years ago when we started this. The third thing we do, the third stool in the leg, is we are the Silicon Valley of creating digital solutions for nonprofit problems, right? So if you think of, like Uber and Airbnb and all these, companies that create this technology to make billionaires, we create technology to enrich other people's lives, such as it can be any cause, like from homelessness to ending hunger to sex trafficking to equity. As long as it's a nonprofit cause, we want to be part of creating those solutions. And then the fourth thing we do is we're not a nonprofit, we're a social benefiting limiting profit organization. And the way we make our money is we do technology services for companies as a professional consulting company. But the difference is we take our profit and we put it into their next generation of talent. And we create social innovations and we include the people who need the help the most. So kind of a long answer, but that's the four things we do.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And that's a really helpful overview. So there's so much to dig into there. I think one of the things you said that's interesting, and I forgot what the exact ages were, but you said there's this kind of drop off where if people aren't getting into tech by whatever it was 18 or something, then there's this steep cliff. Can you talk about that a little bit, like why that happens and just what options are afforded to people in these communities, if not this, like what the way things are going by status quo, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and since our focus is underserved communities, there's not a lot of direct focus in the technology space. So for example, and they're all different, right? Rural, Native American, and urban underserved. And inner city, right? When I say urban underserved, I'm meaning we're not looking at suburbs of places. We're looking at North St. Louis, North Omaha, right? The neighborhoods that need the help the most, right? But there's really I don't want to pick on anybody here, but like let's say we're in an urban area, right? In an inner city area. And somebody will say, well, we already have 2 STEM programs in that area. And I'm like, okay, well, are they working and are people actually getting trained and are they going through it? And if I went and knocked on 100 doors in Ferguson, how many people would say, yeah, I actually knew that opportunity was for me and it's available, right? So, we have a lot of STEM-based programs that are served from the suburbs to the inner city, but are we really getting into them? On the rural and Native American side, the reality is there aren't instructors and teachers to teach it. And that's okay if you're our age, right? Because online programs and video programs work great for mid-career workers, adults. But if you're in high school and you're doing something online or video, we see about a 75% dropout rate, right? Because when you're in high school, if you can't keep your attention span or you get stuck or it gets hard, they just quit. Whereas when you're an adult, you go, okay, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and figure this out. So, and that's just a sidebar too with COVID of why it's been, you look at the statistics, like I'm speaking to high school students all the time going into schools that wear masks, that don't wear masks, and I'm not taking a position on it. But, you look at the impact of these kids, right, of all this online training and, it's just kids don't learn well online, right? Adults can. So it's a major challenge to our society. So really I would just guesstimate from experience about 1 in 15 rural communities can actually get any kind of real software development teaching at any level that's hands-on, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So there's just really a dearth of these opportunities, and there's probably lots of programs that aren't really doing what they should, or people don't know about them, or some combination of those things. With that in mind, can you talk a little bit about like tangibly what these jobs are? Like you mentioned, it's not a coding camp. Are these development jobs? Are these maybe just examples of the sort of digital or technology tasks that are being trained and that sort of thing?
Yeah, our first phase on this is software development, and we're working on expanding that beyond just software development. But there are 1.4 million open computer science jobs unfilled approximately in the US. So it's not like there's a shortage of, like we need to span out and create more. The reason we would create more skill areas is so we could open the opportunity to more people, right? Because not everyone's going to be a software developer, but maybe they'd be great in Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics or another tech area that's more about configuration, right? Not as much hardcore object-oriented, full stack developer programming. But so yeah, it's preparing people for software developers, but we're not a code camp. So there's a 3-phase process to the training program. The first is we have 7 courses that are core computer science courses that students take. Traditionally, we want them to start their junior year of high school. And the reason we pick that is nationally, that's the year that most students can start taking their non-core courses, right? And there's some partners we might work with that can offer, like if the community college locally can offer software development, we'll partner with them. And in most states, it's free for a high schooler to take a dual enrollment community college course, right? So whatever the context of that community is, we have multiple pathways. There's 7 courses students take as prerequisites. So you might learn C# and Java and database and front-end web development and things like this, but you're learning the core language. Then when you complete those prerequisites, you apply to our program. And our program is very unique. It's not test-based, it's not curriculum-based, it's not classroom-based. You join a team of 7 to 12 people, and it's the same as working for a Google or a Microsoft, right? You're working on an agile software craftsmanship, software product team. You're learning scalable and solid and secure. You are building real world solutions. Nothing you build and create gets thrown away. So like if you're writing software in college, you write it, you give it to your professor, they review it, they grade it, they throw it away, right? So, you do it to get your grade and to learn. But in this program, you're literally going to be assigned to a program to attack homelessness or help food banks, right? And you're going to meet with real people that are impacted. You're going to work with the real nonprofits that this solution is going to serve. So there's an impact for you, right? Wow, I'm actually impacting people. And everything you create's going into production. And we're using all the tools, like looking at, again, all the scalability, the maintainability. It's going to be enterprise software that gets deployed. So you are part of minimally for 6 months. And you only graduate our program when you demonstrate you can join a Fortune 500 or a technology startup, and that week start coding and being, point me to your source code, point me to this, right? Where are your build servers? So they're fully, because would you rather hire someone that just finished their training or education, or would you rather hire someone that actually demonstrated they can do their job? And that's why employers line up to hire graduates is, wow, they've demonstrated they can do every aspect of the job.
Yeah, that sounds really compelling. And with that, is there an archetype for the type of student that tends to thrive in this program? Like, do you feel that you're selecting for the sorts of students that might be in these small communities or, underprivileged schools that are the top of those schools that might have gone on to something else? Or is there an archetype of somebody that, might have worked at an auto shop or might have had, that's actually not such a bad job, but let's say like a more menial job, and that they actually rise to the occasion of this? Like, I know we're speaking in generalities, but how would you describe kind of the archetype of a student that does really well in this training?
Yeah, and my answer to that, Dan, is very different than it would have been when I started this industry 35 years ago. Like when I started, it was back, computer science and software development was much more about the sciences, right? I started with Fortran and assembler language, right? And, formula translation. And today though, back then you'd take a developer, you'd put them in the basement, you'd slide a pizza under the door once in a while and code would come out, right? Today, teams are very interactive. So I'd say people who want to work as a team, who are very collaborative, right? Or who can learn to be, and you can be introverted, you can be extroverted, but it's not, you don't have to be a great math major, right? It's very different. The tools are different. It's more, are you a continuous learner? Can you work in a team? We focus as much on emotional intelligence skills as we do on software development skills, because teams today work in an intact work group, right? And I would say in my last decade, the best people I've actually hired that were successful were like foreign language graduates, a lady from Habitat for Humanity that had never done software development in her life, right? And not a math major. So it's very different now because the tool sets, the way people create software, I would say really, do you like to solve problems? Do you like to work as a team? Are you a continuous learner? That's the kind of the core aspects I would say make you most successful, but I really wouldn't rule out anybody. It's just so different now.
Yeah. And I guess with that, are there, to kind of jump a little bit to the college topic, like you talk a lot about this, but I guess, what benefit does college have? Do you have to steel man the go to college versus do this argument, which I'm not saying I agree with, but what benefits do you think going to college has versus a program like this, if any?
Well, I'll give you what my perspective is. The real value is it gives you more time to grow up. So, our program, you're probably going to be in your job by the time you're 20, right? Now that's great. You don't have any debt. You're making at least 60,000 a year. So, do the math. You're starting 3 years sooner than you went to college. You don't have the debt. You make that kind of money for 3 years. So basically, if you went through our program, you've probably made at least 150,000 plus, and you have no debt compared to someone coming out of college, right? And you've got 2 to 3 years experience on them, right? So you're competitively way ahead of them. But they got 4 years to party and enjoy life, right? And to grow up. And so it's kind of a priority there. I would say the other benefit from a 4-year degree, and there's probably a lot of benefits to a 4-year degree, is because I have a 4-year computer science degree myself. I can't say that there's any benefit I got from it versus, I'd rather hire somebody coming through our program than a 4-year degree graduate from a preparedness level. But, still there's a stigma to not having a degree for a lot of people. I think it's less in computer science, and I'm definitely not knocking code camps. There's a lot of great code camps out there, but, you can't compare a code camp graduate to computer science graduate, right? They're just, you got 4 to 6 months to learn everything you learn in a code camp, right? Whereas a 4-year degree, you had 4 years, which is also why our program's at least 3 years long for someone to get through it. Is you're getting experience and exposure and growth over a 3-year period, right? Is you need time to get saturated with all this knowledge and skills.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And to kind of zoom out to the macro a little bit and the labor shortage, can you talk about that a little bit? Like, why do you think this is a big question. You might not have all the answers, but why do you think the labor shortage is happening, and how does this issue kind of apply to that, I guess?
Well, we're not good at getting young people interested in technology, right? That's the first and biggest thing to me. Is I'll go talk to 100 kids and maybe 3 of them have any interest, right? Like, it's because they just don't know why they would be interested. The other is, most people who get computer science degrees, like me, you get into you get your job. And then, I actually only did computer science for maybe 5-6 years in my 35-year career of actually writing software, maybe a couple of years longer than that, because then all of a sudden these other positions open up, right? There's IQ, which is your intelligent quotient. People are very familiar with IQ. Then there's EQ, which is your emotional intelligence. And there's TQ, which is your technology quotient, right? What's your ability to apply technology to solve business problems? Well, that is a very valued, and you can't code, Dan, but you were talking, before we kicked this off about your interest in technology and good. You're probably pretty darn good at applying technology to solving problems. So you may not have as high of a TQ as somebody with a computer science degree, but you've probably got a pretty good TQ to say, okay, I need to solve this problem. How do I do that? So what happens is there's all this demand for high TQ in business, and people that come in with computer science get sucked out of it, right? And also, computer science still has, I don't like the word stigma, but if you're in these other positions, like in management, that's higher than a computer science developer, right? So it's like, if I want my career to continue, it may not be on a technical path. It may be on a management path or an architect or something that's non-coding. And I don't believe in that. And I think companies are wrong in setting that up. But, it's like, oh, for me to have a career, I got to get out of software development. So you have people not staying that long in the software development space when they get in it because they take other positions, and you have not enough people getting into it, right? That was my 2 big reasons I see why there's a big shortage.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we've talked a lot about the perspective of this from a potential employee or worker. To talk about it from the standpoint of the business owner. It sounds like a lot of people listening, maybe they're running a marketing agency or they're in the technology space, and if they've hired dev talent, they've probably outsourced it unless they're in a top-notch tech company and they can afford that Carnegie Mellon, computer science grad or something, right? It seems like those are the 2 options. It's either like India, Eastern Europe, Philippines, et cetera, or you're one of these blue chip companies that can afford the 5 Carnegie Mellon grads that come out every year. So can you talk about that a little bit? Like, why has there been this gap? Like, why is everything in the middle domestically, in terms of like domestic technology talent, been lacking so much? Has it just been inertia and just lack of focus on training? What are the forces that have kind of kept that barren, I guess, if that makes
Well,
sense.
I think if you add up our public and private four-year degree graduates, it's around 80,000 a year approximately, right? With a 1.1 to 1.4 million shortage. So we don't have, well, so there's not the infrastructure for it. We don't have a national strategy, right? You look at India, I mean, they are a national strategy at how do they create and fill these jobs and, offshore them from the US, right? We really, I mean, I work in many, many states. We just don't have a strategy. I mean, we don't have the infrastructure. I live in the state of Iowa, and it's the majority of communities I work with are in Iowa because it's where I started this. And in Iowa, I think it's one of 15 states that requires the high schools to offer a computer science course to high schoolers. They have to offer it, but then you go meet the high school, and it's typically a history teacher who went and had a summer course, but in reality, all they're doing is hitting play on videos. Because how's a history teacher with a summer course going to be able to instruct a computer science course, and when they actually start coding, helping people, right? So it's, how do community colleges hire a computer science instructor for 65,000 a year when they can work for 120,000 a year? So there's such a shortage of computer science instructors and workers because there's such a demand. So there's a lot of tiers and levels to answering that question. But it also seems like in the US, this is probably just more opinion without the fact basis. There's just not, you watch the TV shows and most people are in computer science are the nerdy ones, right? And that persona of just being a nerd is or very good at math is just not accurate. So, and we're really, really poor at getting women into the career. And, you look at nationally, only about 21% of computer science students are women. So these are very creative, interactive jobs that are creating and building and that women thrive in, but they don't know they would be attracted to it. That's a long answer, Dan, but pretty wide spectrum of reasons.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a big thorny issue, and another angle that's involved in that is, and something that I know that you've kind of dealt with a lot is that cultural divide between the coasts and middle America and that sort of thing. And we had, I guess, on the show as a marketing leader at a major CPG brand, and she talked about that. It was really interesting. She was like, all right, we're in the niche of the agency world, and she was describing how hard it is to find agencies that understand middle America, right, in terms of marketing and that sort of thing, because so many of the agency world, the tech world is coastal. So can you talk about that a little bit and how that plays into things, like as you're sourcing talent for these coastal tech companies, how much of that is actually an issue once people start working together? Like, what is it, a blind spot? How much does that come into play?
Yeah, I don't really see any issue there. I mean, in fact, most people, if you look at and I just use Iowa again, right? Over 50% of Iowa's computer science graduates leave the state because they're recruited to go to other states to work. So I don't see any factor of success where people come from as far as, it's just now there's more remote, like I'll name an unnamed company I work with. It's a, tech company on the West Coast. And they are now, because of COVID and their work. So, the West Coast tech companies lead the game, right? As far as being, how do you approach, like they were the first ones to say, hey, work from anywhere is permanent, right? And because of that, though, now they're recruiting out of colleges in the Midwest that they never did before. And you look, so 2 years ago in Iowa, the typical four-year computer science graduate was making around 65,000 a year. Now it's around 80,000 from what I'm seeing in market. But like this one tech company I just met with, their average starting salary for a graduate of a four-year computer science degree, right, 22-year-old, is 160,000 a year. Now, there's only so many of those positions, but now companies in these states have to compete with that because those people had to leave the state to get those jobs before, and now they don't, right? Now they can just stay where they want to live. And I mean, if you make 60,000 a year in rural Iowa as a family, you're in the top 20% of income earners, right? So if you can graduate at 22 and make more than $100,000 a year, you're living pretty high. So it's a great boon for these communities to have those opportunities.
So, Linc, I know one thing that you focus on a lot is like the idea of keeping these communities local, where instead of having to go to a coast or go to a city for somebody to kind of do one of these jobs, they can stay in their hometown. One question that came to mind is, How much is that a priority for people? Do most people that go through this program want to stay in their communities, or is there that call to move and go have that adventure experience as a young person?
Well, and that's Dan, that's one of the biggest things that surprises community leaders is, we'll meet with a group of students in a town. Let's say they're all seniors in high school and they're all students who said, hey, we're leaving, which by the way, is almost every student in a rural community, right? That graduate, what are they going to do?
Yeah.
Right. The education usually isn't there. The job isn't there unless, manufacturing or agriculture, something like that is the thing that surprises community leaders is we'll do like a feedback session right there, and we'll share the opportunity and ask them 2 questions to say, hey, now that you've seen this for future generations, would this be something that would be good for your community, right? And we always get 100% yes. But the answer that most leaders are surprised by is the second question is, if you would have had this opportunity, would have you taken it? And not only do they almost all say yes, they also say yes. And, we actually wanted to stay here and we wouldn't have moved, but we didn't, but there was no option, right? We want to have a modern career and a future, and it just doesn't exist here. And then you watch like community leaders about fall out of their chair because that discussion never happens. And, also what we do is, there's still a lot of jobs in tech where you can travel. If there's somebody that wants to see the world, the last thing we want to do is get them stuck in a community. But if they're working from anywhere, think of this, if you're in, small town Minnesota or Nebraska or wherever, right? Why can't you go work in Seattle or Chicago or, go visit a place for a week and work from there? So, it actually opens your ability to travel and see the world, whether you do it for that company or just do it on your own. So it really is not limiting to see the world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And with that, to kind of flip this back to the business owner perspective, and this is not to be like overly cynical or anything, but if I'm listening to this and I'm running, a small technology business or a marketing agency, et cetera, I've employed mostly offshore developers, either Eastern Europe or India, et cetera. How does this pan out for me? Like, is there comparably priced talent that I can get in the US right now that's probably going to have, less of a language barrier, less of a distance barrier, and that kind of thing? Like, what does that look like for me as an option?
Well, and keep in mind too, the other aspect of what we're doing is, all of our graduates and people come from either Native American, urban underserved or rural communities, right? So if you want to have an impact, if you're looking for $30 an hour labor, this isn't the place to come, right? If you're just looking for cheap labor, but if you're looking for how do we really solve these problems in society and help those people who help it the most, and you might pay 30% more, but you're also going to get people who like don't have the time barrier, don't have the language barrier. So it really is your personal mission, right? And I would say also probably, most companies that are 300 million or more would be more our demographic, other than technology startup companies and companies that are very technology centric. Now, some of the technologies we're looking at moving toward, like Salesforce and Dynamics, now if you're a $2-3 million company, you might hire, but otherwise you're always going to do like a fractional resource. You're going to outsource. It just doesn't make sense to hire a developer if you're $1 million company, right? Again, unless you're a tech startup or something real tech centric. But most of our clients and people, they come to us for 100 graduates, say, hey, how fast can I get 100 people or 10, right? And we definitely have a lot of innovation technology startups that come to us also. And they're also generally, surprisingly, the more techie companies, I shouldn't say surprisingly, but they're the ones who are definitely more open to not making people move. And, and talking about one note to put in here, right, is the opportunity for work from anywhere is not just a Native American rural aspect, right? There's a lot of communities we're working toward implementing in, like we'd love to get into Springfield, Illinois, where, you've got a super high poverty rate of a Black population, right? And there aren't the tech jobs there. There isn't the tech education infrastructure there. So, you can look in Dunn, North Carolina. It's a small rural town that's more than 50% African-American population, right? So having this ability in this program, we want to be in communities that are communities of color, whether they're urban or rural or mid-sized. And really it's about helping those people who just don't have that support structure and help for them today. because the opportunities are there, right? I mean, there's so many jobs in this. And also, when we're talking to a young Black man in inner city and we say, hey, why aren't you going to college? We almost never hear, I don't have the money, right? There's no way I'm going and sitting through 4 years of dying in a classroom, right? So approaches like this, where they're actually solving real world problems and they're part of a team and they're active and they're not just memorizing and taking tests and regurgitating answers, right, for 4 years. I mean, statistically, if you look at both urban, underserved, and rural populations, they have a very significantly lower attendance rate to four-year colleges because that just does not appeal to them, right? So having alternative, innovative approaches for them to learn the skills they need, that's a core aspect of this, right? And we also have a full empowerment coaching because, again, that whole IQ aspect and EQ, I'm sorry, building their emotional intelligence, empowering them, the wraparound services, it's very different supporting people that are at-risk youth than, from a wealthy middle class, suburban area, right? Totally different context.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't know if you would if you would agree with the characterization of like an apprenticeship, but that's something that existed for thousands of years. Through the Middle Ages, there were apprenticeships to get people ready for actual jobs. And it seems like that has kind of been lost, with the 4-year college degree. Yeah.
And just to note there, I've hired hundreds of 4-year computer science degree graduates and had a gajillion interns. And, the challenge in computer science that's unique from plumbing and, HVAC, right, where apprenticeships work great. And I'm not saying apprenticeships don't work in computer science, but the challenge is they're much, much, much more expensive for companies than like plumbing companies. Because, if you're doing a plumbing apprenticeship, you're still doing something valuable, right? If you're doing an internship, you're still doing something valuable. But if you go to college and you've had 3 computer science courses and now you do an internship at a company, what happens is the teams don't want to work with the interns because there's so much overhead for your senior people. I mean, it's just a life drain of your talent because they can't really contribute. It's really an all give to them. So it's a harder match in the technology space. You can still do it. It's just much more expensive than a person's hourly rate because there's a major tax to your senior people. And that's the other reason we're organized this way, is how we do it, right? Is, hey, when you get our people, you're not getting taxed. You're getting somebody who uplifts your team the first week, right? Which even over hiring one of our graduates over a 4-year computer science degree graduate, employers say, you know what, I'll save $25,000 to $35,000 hiring your graduate over a 4-year degree graduate, because even 4-year degree graduates have a tax to them of your senior resources of getting them productive, right? And getting them to actually learn, real world environments.
Right. Getting just how to deal with people in a workplace is like something that a 4-year degree person has never really dealt with before. In some ways, they could be actually worse at it. If I remember myself when I was in college or finishing up. So, and like to kind of ask a bigger question that I might fumble. It sounds like the work you're doing is really important and meaningful. But I'm thinking about technology and kind of like where it's going, over the next 10 to 20 years. And the idea of like the goal of technology is to replace human labor. So I'm wondering how you think about this. Like, what's the potential for the jobs and for the opportunities we can fill, and what happens? Is there a ceiling to that? Is there a point at which there's only so much technology that can serve us? And in that situation, how do you feel about things like UBI or whatever the other solutions are? Like, what's your take on that?
I think I'm a non-believer in that concept, even though I shouldn't be, because I turn Star Trek on and they say chicken noodle soup 72 degrees and it pops out. But through history, what we've seen is anytime, whether it's the industrial revolution, and even in my industry, right, in 35 years, I've been told technical people aren't going to be needed, right? I mean, the time that I got out of software development is when my CIO said, look, software development, and this was back in the early 90s. He said software development is gone. You're not going to need developers. Technology is advancing where you don't need them, right? And I mean, and even today, they're with a 1.4 million shortage, they're predicting a 22% increase in the next 8 years of the need for additional talent that we're getting, right? So one is, and maybe it's because I'm older, but whenever you have an efficiency improvement, you just create more jobs that have to deal with that, right? Whether that's data science. So what history tells me is whenever there's an efficiency improvement, there's higher level jobs. But the problem is the gap really becomes the skills gap, right? Is you get more and more people, if they can't get those skills, that you get the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And those people that can educate their kids with those skills accelerate, and those people who can't, they just fall further behind. So if we keep our focus on helping everyone advance, I don't think we're going to see that phenomena that we keep hearing, but maybe I'm wrong there. I mean, that's something that time will tell, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I've heard that about almost every job. I've heard that about salespeople like myself, like lawyers, and none of it's happening. So I think that's a really good point. And I think hopefully we have a good shot at avoiding a feudalistic situation, right? If we can bring up more people. So you're doing, really great work, Linc, and kind of getting towards the end of the time. How can people follow what you're up to, get in touch and all that good stuff?
Yeah. So if you go to nightmoves.org, and it's night like the chess piece, not like the Bob Seger song. So if you just click contact us, we follow up with anybody who has a question, right? Now, from a community perspective, it's something, if you'd be interested in saying, I'd love to get this in my community, there's a community section that shows, hey, this is what we look for in Imagine Community. That would be a good match. So you can kind of read that and see if it's there. But yeah, reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you.
Awesome. Linc, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dan. What a great conversation.
Yeah, likewise.